Hi, good afternoon. This is Rob Bell, and you're watching Getting the Record Straight. This is the Black Rock Soul segment, and I'd like to welcome you. What are we at? Wednesday afternoon, April 1st. And as I said, this is the Black Rock Soul segment. I hope you get a chance to get to our website, www.blackrocksoul.com, and press on the playlist. That'll take you to our YouTube Black Rock and Soul playlist. Listen to some music there. There's a lot of great stuff going on. Prince. And, I just have really some fantastic artists this week. I'll be changing up tonight. By the way, before I get too far into this, I wanted to let you know, please press the subscribe button. I notice people watching. It varies, obviously, and still pretty new on the scene. But whether you like it or not, at least subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything, and it really will help me moving forward and what we're trying to do, which is to really give you something other than the mainstream media account of what's going on with music and art here in this country, and particularly here in Philly, where we are. I don't know if you can see I'm playing my fraternity shirt, Omega Psi Phi, the day I die. Roo, how's everybody? 2 Mu 73 happening right here. So this is really old school, and certainly informs my perspective on music and again, the art world. Have to remind you to stay safe. I was just on the phone with a couple of people today talking about how important it is to try to be cautious in your traveling. I know that still a lot of us have to go out and do some things, but be as cautious and circumspect as possible as you're moving around. And if you don't have to go out, don't. Stay in and watch Getting the Record Straight. And as I said, you can get to us. The easiest way is just to go on the Black Rock and Soul website and just press Get Record Straight, the button on there. On the web page will get you here. Before I again go much further, I want to give condolences to the family and folks who are followers and fans of Wallace Rooney, another jazz great that's been lost. And to be quite honest, I'm not terribly familiar with his music, although not his specifically, but I know he played on a lot of stuff that I listened to and probably you have listened to. He's really well known. Probably has played with Roy Hargrove and others. Who's one of my favorite. Who we lost early this year, I think it was. But to get on with the show, I just want to retrace my steps a little bit. We've been talking about rock and roll history and the way it's been portrayed as something that came out of the Southern white music community and formulated as rockabilly. That's part of the story, but that's maybe 1/4 of it. In fact, rock and roll had been developed and had been distributed, if you will, and moving across the world, literally, since the mid-40s. And the king of that, and the father of that, was Louis Jourdan. And so, again, I encourage you to, some of these people whose names I'm dropping, to look it up, particularly if you have that kind of interest as a student and, interested in the history of the music. Please look up Louis Jourdan. And so rock and roll, again, it's basically a slang term for rhythm and blues throughout the late 40s and through the 50s. And there is no category as rock pop, as it wouldn't be until I think it's the mid-60s. So everything really is about rhythm and blues, which is effectively the technical term that's on Billboard magazine for rock and roll. So we've been through the 50s. I want to get into the 60s a little bit now. And as I said, in terms of the black styles, and there were at least 4 uh, the jump bluesy kind of big band style that had really been predominant at the start in the mid 40s. And then you had kind of a slower, groovier style, and Fats Domino and others who perfected that. And then there were the singing groups and doo-wop, which was absolutely huge in the 50s. And it's a crime that those groups and individuals who pioneered that are not spoken of, and certainly not spoken of in terms of rock and roll. And then, as I said, there was kind of the more edgier blues stuff, Muddy Waters and those kinds of acts who were doing their thing. But it was all part of the Boogie Woogie trend that had started in the 30s, and this jump kind of movement or big back, backbeat phenomenon that was going on, and that really formed the core of the rock and roll sound, and that was also part of the rockabilly thing too. So anyway, as we get into the 60s, it's, as I've tried to say, two broad kind of categories. Because I think if we're going to talk about this, you have to mention race. You know, the fact that it's black people, the fact that you're still in basically a nation that's an apartheid nation. The civil rights movement is just getting started. And a lot of the sentiment against rock and roll is because it's so oriented in the black culture and black music and dance. And I have to emphasize that again. Dance is an equal part of the music and what's going on. So as we get into the 60s, the rockabilly, represents one group or one style, and predominantly white, but certainly not entirely. Chuck Berry in that group and others, and another direction, if you will, that was more black or more honed and in the foundation of gospel, jazz, and blues. And of course, the hillbilly, the rockabilly having more of the country flavor into it. As we go into the 60s, from the in terms of the black music movement, or black rock and roll, or rhythm and blues, or soul music, any of those things work. You have to look at primarily three areas: Detroit, Chicago, and Memphis. Things are going on elsewhere, New Orleans, Philly, New York, but those three areas are really coalescing around some of the great music minds that will influence not only the 60s, but far beyond that. Of course, in Detroit, you've got the formulation and development of Motown. And that's, I'll have to get the exact dates. In fact, I'll go into Motown in the next show exclusively. But it's the late 50s. And and then in Chicago, you have several record companies and individuals who developed their own sound. Again, kind of out of this soulful black rock and roll genre. And then in Memphis, you have another sound, another strain, if you will, of this black music movement. And so I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about Chicago in particular. Before I get into that, I did want to mention last time when I was talking about that documentary called Bastards of the Party. And again, I strongly encourage you to look that up. Bastards of the Party. I don't know if it's produced, but the guy who really created it was a guy, Cleo Sloan, a.k.a. Bone. And the book that I couldn't remember at the time was called City of Quartz. And that was a book that he read. It was written by Mike Davis. Cleo Sloan read that, and it influenced him and helped him in terms of developing that documentary, Bastards of the Party. But try to get your hands on that, and as well as this book called City of Quartz by Mike Davis. Okay, back up to the 60s and Chicago. And of course, when you talk about early Chicago soul music, rock and roll, black music, you have to talk about Curtis Mayfield. Curtis, in my mind, is one of the kings of rock and roll. Now, I know that it's against the grain to talk about anybody being a king of rock and roll except Elvis. But as far as I'm concerned, that's an anachronistic that's anachronistic kind of thinking. That's it was history in '65. Elvis's relevance, certainly his popularity, had decreased substantially by then. Doesn't take away from his talent, doesn't take away from his historical position. He is a great artist. He is, if you will, a king of rock and roll. But to me, to say that there's only one king, that doesn't make any sense. There's been many people whose impact has just been absolutely tremendous, transformative. Has its impact has gone beyond the immediate and had long-term and historical effects. And there's several people like that. And as far as I'm concerned, they're kings as well as the queens. And one of those people is Curtis Mayfield. He's one of the greatest singer-songwriters of all time. In fact, Curtis is one of the people who really started making music that had a message to it. I know that the common, again, mainstream talking point often is that, it was Bob Dylan who was the first to, start putting messages, if you will, music of some substance and consequence. Excuse me. I don't think he's the first. I think you really have to look at Sam Cooke, perhaps, as the first person to really do some challenging themes in terms of music. But certainly Curtis Mayfield is right there. All you have to do is look. And in addition to that, which I will at some point get into it, but there was a movement in jazz in the early 60s to really begin to address particularly civil rights and many other consequential issues at that time. And Max Roach, who I had an opportunity to see, and is, again, one of the great artists of all time, certainly one of the greatest drummers and composers. And, Max was one of the ones leading the way in terms of jazz and dealing with some controversial issues. He actually did an album in the early 60s called We Insist, as well as his Freedom Now suite. And so you really need to definitely look at Max Roach and several other jazz artists, particularly in the early 60s. But Curtis with Keep On Pushing, People Get Ready being one of the great songs of all time. We're a Winner, Moving On Up. Amazing stuff by Curtis. And of course, in Chicago, you had other artists in the early 60s who were really moving the music forward, including one of my favorites, Billy Stewart. Of course, one of the great singing groups of all time, the Dells. Etta James, Major Lance, who I just found out his daughter is the mayor of Atlanta, I believe. The great Gene Chandler, the Duke of Earl, and of course the great Jerry Butler. I'm going to stop there, but we'll do a little more on Chicago on our next visit. This is Getting the Record Straight, the Black Rock and Soul edition. Take care. Stay safe.